Hi, I'm Perry Atkinson, General Manager here at the Dove. Hey, check out our other videos and check out our website at theDove.us.
Well, welcome back to Focus Today. Steve Johnson with you, and I've got two guests. Mary Martin is an author of a book called Those Were the Days, and also we're with a retired World War II vet, Cal Pipal, and we're going to find out both of their stories. Of course, today is the day that we are commemorating those who have served in the various wars, branches of service in our area. And Cal, let me first talk to you about World War II. You're a World War II vet, and you were in a lot of places.
Yes.
Weren't you, during that incursion?
Yes, 17 different places in the U.S. here.
And now, what division were you in World War II?
Air Force.
Air Force, okay.
Mm-hmm. Then it was the Army Air Corps.
That's right, yeah. That didn't come till after World War II.
Yeah, the Army Air
right?
Corps. Then during the war it was the Army Air Force, and after the war it was the Air Force.
And what did you do in the Air Corps?
I was, I was trained as a navigator on a B-29.
A B-20, oh wow, yeah. Really? Mm-hmm. So you took quite a few flights, obviously.
Oh yeah, a lot of training flights, yes.
How many of those are still flying? Do you know?
One.
One? Wow.
One.
I think
Too bad, because there were thousands of them at the end of the war, but they were all destroyed, but one is still flying. It's by the Commemorative Air Force down in Texas there.
And I know that B-24s and B-17s the same way.
Yep,
There's
right.
just a handful of any of those.
That's right.
So
yep.
That's an amazing thing for sure. Mary Martin is the author of a book called Those Were the Days, and this has to do. In fact, let me just look at the subtitle here: Profiles of Americans During the Great Depression and World War II. I mean, you're covering quite a large topic there when you have the Depression and World War II together. What was your motivation in writing this book?
Well, I'm a psychotherapist by trade, and the people that went through this era they deal with disappointment in a very different way than people do today.
Oh yeah, elaborate on that.
Yeah.
In how? How do you see that?
Well, there's a concept called radical acceptance, and what it is you jump, instead of grieving and staying in those stages of grieving, you jump to a place of acceptance. And then when you do that, you're asking, okay, now what? What am I going to do with this now?
So what you do is you jump over the stages that we've had before of anger, of
the depression and the bargaining. And
is this a generational thing? Is that why people have done this? Do you find it with certain groups of people, like the World War II depression people?
No, I think it's generational.
Yeah.
I think that what I found I interviewed about 20 people, and I've talked to lots of other people that are not in the book. And what I find is that their expectations were very different than they are today. And I think we could learn from these people.
Yeah, well, juxtapose those. And Cal, you might want to jump in on that too. The expectations are, and we've seen it generationally, but what have you actually been able to see from a standpoint of how they kind of come at loggerheads with each other? What are the expectations of the older generation versus the newer ones? Are we like quick satisfaction and theirs is more earned, that type of thing, or how does that work?
I think that they're basic, and my father grew up during this era. He was a World War II soldier as well. And he taught me that if you have a roof over your head and you have food on the table, you're doing well.
Is that your experience, Cal?
I would support that, because having grown up through the Great Depression, you know, if you had a roof over your head at that time, that was something. So your expectations were just basic. If you got beyond those, great. You worked for it and you got it. But the expectations were very basic. Food and shelter. That was about it.
And that's quite different than now, you're saying, obviously.
Well, the other thing that I saw that was really beautiful is that there was community back then. There was no welfare, there were no food stamps. As people went to the church, they went to their neighbors. Neighbors helped each other back then, didn't they?
No. Something when somebody needed some help, and I was in a farm area too.
Were you? Yeah.
But you know, all the farmers would come together and see how they could help that individual.
And you had to. I mean, you had no other option.
Yeah, you had no other option.
Did you think that the government would step in to help out?
No, nothing like that at the time. That's one of the big differences I see today. You worked it out yourself and within the community. Mm-hmm. Today is what can the government give me? In my opinion, quite a drastic change. Yeah. And I think people don't stop to realize that the government doesn't give you anything without first taking it away from somebody else. And so I guess the sense of values are quite remarkably different from when I was a kid. Of course, I'm 90 years old now, and that's a long time, and so you see a lot of change.
Yeah, and you mentioned you were from a rural area. Where did you grow up?
So, on a farm in southwestern Wisconsin.
Oh, okay. And then you went off to World War II, yes. And then did you come back to that farm?
No, I went back and went to college and got a degree in engineering.
That's right, because you were a retired chemical engineer for 3M.
Yes,
Now that's quite a bit beyond the basic roof over the head and all the rest. Was this as a result? Did you have a change during the war? Do you think to give you that opportunity that you wouldn't have otherwise had?
Yes, definitely. Because when I left high school, there were very few people that went on to college. College was more for the rich, but. Congress passed, I think it was the best piece of legislation ever passed, the GI Bill of Rights. So people came back from service, they could get money from the GI Bill of Rights and go to college, which is something they would have never been able to do otherwise. So that was a fantastic piece of legislation.
And you were able to become a chemical engineer because of that, right? Yeah. Well, Mary, let me ask you, from what you've seen with the generation that kind of grew up during those austere times, and now the ones that I'll just summarize it by, it's like the government owes me something, or I am owed something by somebody, whoever that is. How does that come to meld within your book, Those Were the Days? It sounds like those are two opposites, kind of butting against each other's head. Is that what you've experienced?
Yeah, I do. I wanted those values to be shared with people, and so at the end of each chapter, I have questions that families can sit down with the book and they can read each chapter, and then they can reflect on it, so that they can really start reflecting and questioning the values that they're assuming in their lives. Yeah.
You know, and the biggest change that I would say between what Cal has been talking about and what you're saying is, I remember there was a movie, I think it was with Steve Martin, where the family was growing up, and it was like the little kids were the little gods in the family, and the parents had to do everything. You know, their schedules had to work around the kids' schedules to make sure the kids were successful and happy, and everything they did was correct. I mean, that is really quite the opposite when you were growing up, I imagine. It was more survival, I would imagine.
It was survival, right?
Yeah.
And for example, Mary, going through the Depression, it was very difficult, but I took a man's place on the farm when I was 14 years old. I got up at 5 in the morning, I worked until 8 in the evening, just along with my dad, and all of the farm kids did it. You had to do it.
I was going to say, you weren't really alone in that. That was kind of what was expected.
No.
Did you like that? I mean, you had no choice, really.
I dislike it because it was accepted that that's what you had to do to survive. And so, you know, I didn't dislike it, although it was hard work.
Your children, grandchildren, can they relate to some of those issues? People who are younger, in their teens now? I mean, when you bring that up, do you get a look of just a blank look on their face? I can't quite relate to that?
No, in my case, at least, well, I'll give you an example. I went on a trip with parts of my family. One was a grandson. And one evening we just sat and talked. They just asked me lots of questions. And my grandson, who is now about 30, said, "Grandpa, the best part of that whole trip," we went down to Yosemite and other places, was that evening I spent listening to you.
Oh, nice.
And that was quite a compliment, I thought.
Yeah, and you were probably just thinking, well, it's...
Yeah, they'd ask me questions, and I'd tell them about my life, and that he had such a tremendous interest in it.
Why is it that people from your generation have a hard time opening up about World War II and some of those tough times? It seems like one has to kind of probe to find that out. What do you think the reason is for that?
I'm not really sure of that, but you're right, that's what it is. But I think as they say, well, I was in the service during the war, so were thousands of other people, so were millions of other people in World War II, 16 million in the military service. And that's 20% of the male population at that time was in the military. So everybody did it. So come home and you just wanted to start a new life and go on with things. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was what everybody did, so it wasn't that big of a deal, is kind of what it looks like. When, I'm just curious, when Tom Brokaw wrote the book, The Greatest Generation, what did you think of that?
That was a good book. It was an excellent book, yeah. And I could relate to most of the things that were in it, yes.
Yeah. Fascinating. I'll tell you what, we're going to be continuing our discussion. We're talking with Mary Martin, the author of Those Were the Days. We're going to find out a little bit about some of the research that she did and what she came away with more on that book, have her elaborate a little bit on that. And also Cal Pipal, retired chemical engineer for 3M and also a veteran from World War II in the Army Air Corps. So more on that coming up in just about 2 minutes here on Focus Today. Well, welcome back to Focus Today. Our guests today are Mary Martin. She's the author of a book called Those Were the Days, and Cal Pipal, a retired chemical engineer for 3M and also a World War II veteran in the Army Air Corps, who I found out during our break moved from Minneapolis to Medford to get out of the cold winters. And I think a lot of people can relate to all of that, so that's nice. Although we're going to have chilly weather here, it's nothing like what they've been having there for sure. And I want to mention that Mary has written a book called Those Were the Days, and it talks about the Great Depression as well as World War II, and you've got a lot of profiles in there of some of the individuals that you talked to who went through both of those experiences. Is that right?
Yeah.
What was it that you came across from that generation that kind of struck you, maybe surprised you in talking to some of those people?
I think their adaptability, which adaptability is a measure of mental health. And so they were extremely adaptable, and I do think it's because their expectations about life are very different. I think they also, faith was common back then, to have faith. And if the community you're in has faith, I think that it's a support system for that as well.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned that. An experience that I had was interesting. We sometimes think of older generations as not being able to adapt to what's happening new. And my brother and I think it was he and I were talking, this was several years ago. I had a couple of great aunts who, you know, we were really discussing, can people adapt? Is that really a problem? And you stopped and you look back and you realize, okay, here's a generation, slightly before your time, Cal, who they'd never seen an airplane. All of a sudden, one is flying in the air. And then now they're flying in jets. Okay, trains, kind of unusual. Now that, back then, you know, in some places, they had grown through all of that. Automobiles, they never saw one, and then this thing comes puttering down the road, and now, you know, they're driving a Buick. You know? So, I mean, you know, and then layer upon that the use of computers and everything else. And I think one has to look at that to say, okay, because maybe they don't adapt the way you think that they should, these are people who have adapted an awful lot. And and I think even you're adapting. You grew up in a rural area of, what state again?
Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, and come back from World War II, and through the GI Bill become a chemical engineer that you probably hadn't anticipated at all. I would imagine at that point you thought, had your dreams come true? Even dreams you didn't have. I mean, because you'd never thought of being a chemical engineer, did you?
Really, the last year in high school, I had a wonderful principal of the high school, small high school, 100 students, 44 years. And he sensed what my strong points were, math and science, and he guided me into engineering. If it wouldn't been for him, I wouldn't have been in engineering. Yet, if I were doing things over, I'd do the exact same thing that I did.
Yeah.
I was so pleased with the overall, but I had guidance there.
And he probably never thought that he was giving you something that would impact you throughout your whole career.
That's true, yeah.
And it shows the impact of one person on lives. Did you find that also, Mary, in your book about how people were impacted by maybe seemingly small issues, but kind of changed their lives in some ways?
You know, I think a lot of what I was learning were that there were big issues back then, much bigger than I think we experience today.
Like what? Like what did you find?
People died of the flu.
Oh, yeah.
The polio epidemic had not been resolved at that point, and there was one family I interviewed where they were just ready to buy their first house, and he contracted polio, and for 2 years he was in bed with his wife going in and out of the bedroom. Nobody else went in.
Wow.
There was a sign in front of their house stating that, you know, there was somebody here with polio, and everybody walked on the other side of the street because it was so contagious.
That's pretty amazing, because we wouldn't even think of that these days, but
No.
yet back then, you're right, it was a different kind of emphasis, really.
They
wasn't it?
lost their house, they lost their income, they went to live with family because families helped families, communities helped communities. This man, he created a job driving kids to school in a rural area because he had use of one leg and one arm.
Wow.
And he figured out something he could do. Later, he bought a restaurant, and first he worked in it, and he was disabled the rest of his life. And then he bought it, and then he bought another place fixing washers, dryers, things of that nature.
Yeah. Do you find that theme then throughout, a sense of community? I'm just trying to see what it is that maybe we have as ties to the past as well as those things that we don't have. Is there a sense of community now but just different, or do you think we have a lack of
I
community?
think well, as a therapist dealing with people all day long, definitely, as I hear a lot of loneliness, isolation, that yes, I think really there was more community back then. And also, people had time to ponder. Is when you think about how they washed clothes, is they put them through the wringer washing machine. Everything was done by hand. They hung the clothes on the line. As they had time to think, to ponder, to relax. We're going from thing to thing to thing to thing.
Yeah.
And our brains aren't meant to work that way.
I think we think we're multitasking, but we're just doing a lot of single things one after another and coming back to the first one again. That kind of comes out that way.
Yeah.
Cal, when you look back and how life was different, what would you say are the biggest differences from when you grew up to what you see now?
I think, well, first of all, let's go back to sciences. I think in my lifetime, the two big advances would have been in medicine and in electronics. Well, getting a man to the moon. Would everybody ever thought of that when I was a kid? Heaven's sakes, no. Buck Rogers, but that was about as far as it would ever go.
Yeah.
Well, look what's happened. But the other thing is, again, I go back to what you said, Mary, the sense of community. Even though I lived on a farm out of town, the closest neighbor was a quarter mile away. But and in town, there was that small town, there was just that strong sense of community. You weren't going to get a government handout or anything like that. That was unheard of. You had to do it yourself, and you had to help others do it. And you don't see that today. I don't feel it today. First of all, there's internet. You can get whatever answer you need on internet. So why bother with anything else? To me, we've lost that. I can't say we've lost the sense of community, but it is downgraded from what it used to be. So those are the differences that I see.
And the family, I mean, the definitions have changed so much as well. And I would think that you know, you talk about small towns had a sense of community. I would imagine that with the technology we have now, you know, they say that you can be the most lonely person in a room full of people. So it doesn't matter how big or small a community is you're in, you can still have those problems that way. As far as when the title of your book, Mary, Those Were the Days, sound like it was always better than it is now, but I suppose it's a mixed bag as well because of the problems you mentioned, the polio, the flu, people dying of flu. We don't really think too much of that so much. Let's look at the positive things that we see now that we have. Is there, I suppose that'd be medicine would be one of the biggest things, but are there other sociological aspects that you see that have improved greatly over then?
I think there was more racism back then than there is now.
Yeah, there definitely was.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, even in the Army or Corps and the military, you had the separate.
That was segregated. Yeah.
Segregated. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there was one other thing I was thinking of as well. Divorce. I've been with my husband for over 40 years, so I'm not an advocate of divorce, but I interviewed somebody who was a child of divorced parents, and she was an outcast, as other parents wouldn't let their children play with her.
And this was a product of this era that you're talking about, the Depression and
stuff. Yes, and so I think that our society tries to be more open, more accepting, hopefully more loving.
But it sounds like we have to relearn some of the things that from Cal's generation, maybe that sense of community.
Less self-sufficiency, I think.
And how does one, I mean, to kind of go in slightly a different direction from what we've been talking about, but how does one move into that? Because that's a tough thing to do, because we're all thought to be, you have to be self-sufficient, you have to kind of, you know, get a government program if you need help and that kind of thing. Do you have any suggestions on how we go about creating that sense of community again?
Absolutely. I think that all of us are here. When you think, I have clients that come in and they want to know what's the purpose of their life? Why are they here? And I think it's to serve. I think we need to serve and be purposeful in that area. And so instead of focusing on ourselves, which I think our society does a little bit too much, is if you have a little extra, to look outside of yourself, to think about what can you do to help somebody else.
And that has to be, while as that was maybe a natural effort when you were growing up, that may be something that we have to actively seek out, because there are certainly, I talk to a lot of people with Access Health or the Salvation Army or whatever. I'm sure they can use a lot of help if people were just to make themselves available to do that kind of thing. So especially as I'm thinking we're coming up to Christmas, Thanksgiving. We think of these seasonal things, but I think if we were to institute what you're talking about as a lifestyle, that could certainly have an impact. Not only helping others, but also yourself too, because what you get back, you know, has such a great emphasis too.
You know, one of the things I recommend to clients that are feeling lonely or are isolated in some way is to identify a volunteer opportunity that they think is purposeful. And to get involved in something so that you're giving, because I think we feel we get back much more than we give.
I can vouch for that, because when I was 75 years old, I was asked to be chairman of the building committee at our church.
Oh, yeah.
And
what did you think? What did you think of that?
It was, well, I thought it'd be simple and easy, but we ran into a lot of opposition, so we went 3 years of litigation. And before it was a 6-year assignment, really. Yeah. But we prevailed. But I look at it, and yeah, I gave whatever God-given talents. I used whatever God-given talents I had. But the big thing is, I received more from that experience than I gave. Yeah. And it was reaching out and doing some work, really volunteer, and getting rewarded just immensely.
That's cool. Yeah.
And I look at the things I've done where I've reached out and helped or tried to help. I've gotten more back than I have given. I get good returns on those investments. So, And it was been a wonderful experience.
And now you're thinking twice so about when they want you to be on a church committee again. It may not be as simple as what it looks like.
Right?
A church building committee, that has to be one of the most complex situations, I think, to be on it, let alone be the head of it.
It was because of the legal aspects here.
Yeah. Cal, thanks for being here, as well as Mary Martin. Let me mention, Mary's book is called Those Were the Days, and it's subtitled Profiles of Americans During the Great Depression and World War II. And Cal Pipal, retired chemical engineer and a World War II veteran, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.